I never thought a simple driveway could spark an all-out war. But when the HOA decided my private driveway was suddenly community property, they had no idea who they were messing with. It all started one morning when I walked outside to grab the newspaper and found a brand new HOA sign posted at the edge of my driveway. It read, "Private driveway. Now designated as community access road. No unauthorized modifications allowed." I blinked, thinking maybe I was still half asleep. This was my driveway. It had been there for decades, leading up to the 5-acre property my grandfather left me. The land had been in our family for generations, long before the HOA even existed. I stormed back inside and grabbed my phone. The first person I called was Mr. Lawson, my lawyer, but he didn't answer. So I tried the next best thing, the HOA president herself, Margaret Delaney. Margaret was a power-hungry woman in her late 50s, with a love for pencil skirts, expensive handbags, and making people miserable. The HOA was her little empire, and she ruled it with an iron fist. I had no doubt she was behind this ridiculous stunt. "Sure enough," she answered on the first ring. "Ah, Mr. Walker, I was expecting your call," she said, sounding almost smug. "Cut the formalities, Margaret. What's this nonsense about my driveway?" "It's quite simple," she said sweetly. "Your driveway is now designated as a community access road. Several of our residents have requested easier access to the park, and your property conveniently provides the most direct route." "You mean they're too lazy to drive the long way around?" "Mr. Walker," she sighed dramatically, "we all have to make sacrifices for the good of the neighborhood. Besides, you still have access to your home. This is just a formality." "A formality?" I scoffed. "You're telling me that my privately owned driveway is now open for the entire neighborhood to use, and I can't do anything about it?" "Well, if you want to file an appeal, you're welcome to attend our next HOA board meeting," she said. "Oh, I'll be there," I growled. But Margaret had no idea that I wasn't just going to attend the meeting. I was going to tear her entire scheme apart. I spent the next few hours digging through my grandfather's old property records. He had been a meticulous man, keeping every document, every letter, every survey. And that's when I found it. A handwritten note from 40 years ago tucked inside an old file folder labeled "Easement Rights, Walker Property." It was a letter from my grandfather to the county zoning board, written in his unmistakable cursive. "For clarity, this driveway remains private and is not designated for public or shared use. Any attempts to alter its designation without legal ownership transfer will be considered trespassing." Bingo. But it got better. As I compared old maps to the new HOA layouts, I realized something huge. Not only was my driveway private property, but the HOA's entire public access plan was illegal. Margaret and her cronies had redrawn property lines without my consent, trying to claim the smallest sliver of my land in their favor. They thought I wouldn't notice. Oh, they had no idea what was coming. The night of the HOA meeting, I walked into the community center with a file full of evidence. The room was packed. Homeowners lined the chairs, some standing along the back wall. Margaret sat at the head of the table, a self-satisfied smirk on her face. "Mr. Walker, thank you for joining us," she said, barely hiding her amusement. "Shall we begin?" I didn't sit down. Instead, I walked to the front of the room and pulled out a large map of the neighborhood, the original property survey. "Before we start," I said, "I'd like to clarify something for everyone here. This is the original legal map of my property, before the HOA existed." The room quieted as I unrolled the massive map on the table. Several board members leaned in, their smugness slowly turning into confusion. "And this," I continued, slapping another map down on top of it, "is the modified version that the HOA submitted to the county, without my knowledge." A few gasps came from the crowd. Some homeowners whispered to each other, realizing the implications. Margaret's face paled. That's not possible," she stammered. "Oh, but it is," I said smoothly, pulling out the letter from my grandfather. "This letter, written 40 years ago, states in legal terms that my driveway is private and cannot be used as a public access road. Any attempt to claim it is, in fact, trespassing." A few HOA members looked at Margaret uneasily. She was losing control of the room. Additionally, I said, turning toward the crowd, anyone who has been using my driveway under this false claim, thanks to Margaret's scheme, has technically been trespassing on private property. I knew Margaret wouldn't take the embarrassment of the last HOA meeting lightly. I just didn't expect her to strike back so fast. The morning after the meeting, I stepped outside to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Violation notice. Unauthorized construction on community property. I ripped it off, my blood boiling. Construction? Community property? This was my land. I hadn't built anything. Yet. Then I saw them. 2 HOA compliance officers stood at the end of my driveway, clipboard in hand, smug expressions on their faces. Next to them was a tow truck hooking up to my pickup truck. My truck, parked in my driveway. I marched toward them. What the hell do you think you're doing? One of them, a rat-faced guy in a cheap blue polo, smirked. Your vehicle is in violation of community guidelines. I laughed. That's rich. This is private property. The second guy, a shorter, balding man with thick glasses, spoke up. Actually, according to the HOA's most recent map, this driveway is part of the neighborhood's shared infrastructure, and HOA rules clearly state that oversized vehicles cannot be parked in community spaces. I felt my fists clench. That's funny, because just last night, I proved that your new maps are illegal. Ratface shrugged. File a complaint if you want. Meanwhile, this truck is getting impounded. I wasn't going to let that happen. I pulled out my phone and hit record. You do realize you're trespassing, right? You're on private property, enforcing illegal rules, and stealing my vehicle. Ratface hesitated for a moment. He hadn't expected me to push back, but then he smirked. Margaret said you might try something like this. No worries, we're acting within HOA policy. I smiled back. A slow, deliberate smile. Good. Then you won't mind if I call the sheriff. 15 minutes later, Sheriff Daniels pulled up in his patrol car. He was an older guy, had been in town long before the HOA took over, and he didn't much care for their nonsense. When he stepped out of his car and saw the tow truck, the HOA officers, and me standing in the middle of it all, he sighed. Walker, what's going on now? I handed him the violation notice. They're claiming my driveway is community property and that my truck is in violation. But as you know, my land is privately owned. They're trespassing. The sheriff turned to the HOA guys. This true? Ratface suddenly looked less confident. We're just following the updated community guidelines. Daniels frowned. Yeah? Because last I checked, private property laws trump HOA rules, and I don't recall Walker's land ever being legally rezoned. The HOA officers exchanged nervous glances. Daniels crossed his arms. If you touch that truck, I'll have you arrested for trespassing and attempted theft. The tow truck driver immediately unhooked my truck and sped off. But I wasn't done. I pulled out another document. This one from my lawyer, Mr. Lawson. Sheriff, I also have something else for you. A cease and desist order. Effective immediately. The HOA is barred from enforcing any rule changes until a full property review is completed. Daniels took it, scanning the document. Looks legal to me. He turned to the HOA officers. Looks like your little land grab is on hold. Now get off his property before I charge you both. They left, but not before Ratface shot me a look of pure hatred. I smiled and waved as they drove off. I knew this was just the beginning. Margaret wouldn't give up this easily. Sure enough, later that afternoon, I received an email from the HOA. Due to multiple violations, your property is now subject to increased HOA oversight. A full compliance audit will take place next week to assess necessary changes. I had to laugh. They were doubling down. Fine. If they wanted war, I'd give them one. That night, I made a few calls. To my lawyer, to a real estate developer friend, and to the local news station. If the HOA thought they could harass me into submission, they were about to learn a very expensive lesson. Because I had a plan. One that would turn their own rules against them. And Margaret? She had no idea what was coming. If Margaret and her HOA goons thought they could break me with fines, harassment, and intimidation, they had another thing coming. I spent the next 48 hours digging into every HOA policy, land record, and legal precedent I could find. And what I discovered was even worse than I imagined. They had illegally rezoned properties, fabricated violations, and funneled HOA fees into consulting firms that, surprise, surprise, were owned by Margaret's husband, son, and 2 board members. It was a racket, one designed to squeeze homeowners dry while they lined their own pockets. So, I decided it was time to hit back. Hard. Step 1. Their own rules would be their undoing. I showed up unannounced to the HOA office the next morning, armed with a thick folder of documents. Margaret was already there, holding court with her cronies. She barely looked up when I entered. "Walker," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "I was wondering when you'd come crawling in." I set the folder down on her desk and leaned in. "Actually, I'm here to give you a friendly warning." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh? About what?" I smiled. "About your little slush fund, the one that's been draining HOA dues into private accounts." The room went silent. I watched as Margaret's smile froze before she quickly forced a laugh. "That's nonsense. You don't have any proof of that." I pulled out a stack of financial records. "Actually, I do, and I just sent copies to the local news station, the county commission, and every homeowner in this neighborhood." Her face drained of color. One of the board members, a nervous-looking guy in his 50s, grabbed one of the papers and scanned it. "Margaret, this shows $85,000 in landscape maintenance fees going to a company owned by your son." Margaret snatched the paper out of his hands. "This is a lie," I shrugged. "If it's a lie, then you won't mind an independent audit, right?" The other board members suddenly weren't so sure about their fearless leader. Margaret slammed the folder shut. "You think you're clever, Walker? You're playing with fire." I leaned in. "No, Margaret, you are." And I just handed the match to the authorities. Step 2. The homeowners' revolt. That night, I hosted a second emergency community meeting. Except this time, almost every homeowner showed up. People were furious. The Johnsons had been fined $2,000 for painting their door the wrong shade of blue. The Patel family had $900 in compliance fees for a fence that had been there for 15 years. The Watsons had paid thousands in road repair assessments. Except no repairs had ever been made. One by one, people stood up and shared how the HOA had scammed, bullied, and harassed them. And by the time I was done showing them the financial fraud, the illegal zoning changes, and the phony violation fees, I had them ready to burn the entire HOA to the ground. That's when I made my move. "We don't have to take this," I said, pacing the room. "We can dissolve this HOA and take our neighborhood back." A murmur spread through the crowd. "We'd need a vote," someone said. I held up a petition. "Already prepared. We need a 67% majority to kick Margaret and her cronies out. And as of 10 minutes ago, I have 75%. The room erupted. People cheered, clapped, and hugged each other. Margaret? She was nowhere to be seen, but she wasn't done yet. Because the very next morning, I woke up to a foreclosure notice on my front door. Step 3. Margaret's desperate last move. Margaret and her remaining allies had pulled a last-ditch stunt. They had filed an emergency foreclosure order, claiming that my property was in violation of HOA regulations and subject to repossession. That was her final mistake. I marched straight into court that same afternoon. My lawyer presented. The original land surveys proving my property was never under HOA jurisdiction. The forged zoning records showing how Margaret had illegally redrawn property lines. The financial fraud documents detailing how HOA money had been laundered into private accounts. The judge barely even glanced at Margaret before ruling. My land was officially removed from HOA control. The HOA was dissolved effective immediately. Margaret, along with 2 board members, was placed under investigation for fraud. Margaret was escorted out of court in handcuffs, and as she passed me, she hissed under her breath, You ruined everything. I just smiled. No, Margaret. I saved everyone. Epilogue. 1 year later. A year later, the neighborhood was thriving. With the HOA gone, people actually enjoyed their homes. No more ridiculous fines. No more intimidation. No more corruption. As for Margaret, she was facing multiple felony charges, and rumor had it, she lost her house to unpaid legal fees. I stood on my porch, watching kids ride their bikes down the street, neighbors chatting happily in their front yards. My grandfather had built this land for people to live in peace. And now, it finally was. The HOA tried to steal from me, but in the end, I took everything from them instead. If Margaret thought slapping a foreclosure notice on my door would break me, she had no idea who she was dealing with. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every homeowner she had bullied, cheated, and stolen from. I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was going to bring the entire corrupt HOA crashing down. The legal showdown. The very next morning, I stood in the county courthouse, my lawyer beside me as we prepared to obliterate Margaret's fraudulent foreclosure attempt. Margaret arrived with a team of expensive attorneys, her usual smug expression back in place. She was confident, too confident. She thought she still had power. She thought the system was still rigged in her favor. She was dead wrong. The judge, an older woman who clearly had no patience for HOA nonsense, wasted no time. "Ms. Reynolds," she said, adjusting her glasses, "you've issued a foreclosure notice against Mr. Walker. Can you provide the specific HOA regulation he has violated?" Margaret smiled, flipping through her neatly organized papers. "Yes, Your Honor. According to HOA Section 12.4b, properties must conform to the established architectural standards of the community. Mr. Walker's property." The judge held up a hand, cutting her off. "I've already reviewed the documents." She turned to me. "Mr. Walker, do you have evidence that your property does not legally fall under the HOA's jurisdiction?" I stood up, holding up the original land deed surveys and county records. "Yes, Your Honor. This land has never been part of the HOA. It was illegally absorbed by a zoning change that was neither approved by the previous owner, my grandfather, nor properly recorded with the county." Margaret's smile faltered. The judge flipped through the documents, her frown deepening with every page. "Ms. Reynolds," she said, "this zoning adjustment was filed by your husband's law firm." Margaret stiffened. "Your Honor, these adjustments were made to ensure proper community planning." The judge leaned forward. "Without the property owner's consent?" Silence. "And according to these records," the judge continued, "this foreclosure notice was filed without legal standing. Furthermore, there are numerous financial discrepancies in your HOA's records that raise serious concerns." She turned to Margaret's attorneys. "I strongly suggest your client consider withdrawing this claim before I initiate a full-scale investigation." Margaret's lawyers whispered frantically to her. For the first time, real fear crept into her eyes. Margaret crumbles. Less than 10 minutes later, Margaret's lawyers stood up. "Your Honor, our client wishes to withdraw the foreclosure action." The judge nodded. Wise choice. I thought Margaret would take her loss with dignity. She didn't. As we left the courtroom, she turned to me, her eyes blazing. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." I smiled. "Actually, Margaret, I know exactly what you're capable of. And that's why this isn't over." Taking it all down. That same night, I called for a full neighborhood vote to officially dissolve the HOA. Margaret tried to rally support, but after everything I had exposed, she was done. Final vote count, 83% in favor of dissolving the HOA. That was it. Margaret was out. The HOA was finished. And the very next morning, county officials arrived with an order to audit every last HOA financial record. Margaret's face turned white as she watched them walk into the HOA office, armed with court orders and subpoenas. I stood nearby, arms crossed, as I watched her empire collapse. I knew what was coming, and I wasn't wrong. Within a month, investigators found hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent expenses, kickback schemes, and illegally issued fines. Margaret was arrested for fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying legal documents. The entire community cheered when she was hauled off in handcuffs. A year later, our neighborhood was completely transformed. No more ridiculous fines, no more bullying, no more corruption. With the HOA gone, we actually took control of our own neighborhood. The money Margaret had stolen? It was returned to the homeowners. The community finally felt like home again. And as for Margaret? She was serving a 6-year prison sentence. Her house was auctioned off to pay back stolen HOA funds. And the best part? I bought it. I stood on my new front porch, sipping a cold beer, looking at the very neighborhood she had once terrorized. She tried to steal my home. She tried to destroy my life. And in the end, I took everything from her. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of an engine idling outside. Peering through the blinds, I spotted a black SUV parked at the edge of my driveway. I didn't recognize the vehicle, but I had a good idea who sent it. Margaret. She wasn't going to let this go without a fight. I stepped outside, keeping my expression neutral, as a man in a crisp suit climbed out of the driver's seat. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his mid-30s, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who wasn't used to hearing the word no. "Mr. Lawson," he said, offering a tight-lipped smile. "I'm Richard Hayes. I represent the Fox Hollow Homeowners Association." "I figured," I replied, folding my arms. "What can I do for you?" He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're prepared to offer you a settlement, a generous one, in exchange for dropping your legal challenge and allowing the development to proceed as planned." I scoffed. "You mean in exchange for me looking the other way while Margaret and her cronies continue to steal from homeowners?" His smile didn't falter, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Annoyance. Maybe even concern. "I understand this situation has been difficult, but let's be realistic. Fighting the HOA in court will be expensive. You may have filed an injunction, but that's temporary. Do you really want to spend years battling this?" I leaned against the porch railing, studying him. "I'm willing to fight as long as it takes, and something tells me Margaret is more worried than she's letting on. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here." He exhaled sharply, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. "What exactly do you want, Mr. Lawson?" "I want the truth to come out. I want the homeowners you've scammed to get their money back. I want the illegal development stopped." "Those are big demands," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a warning. "Then you'd better start preparing for a big loss." For the first time, his polished demeanor cracked. He didn't like that answer. Without another word, he turned on his heel, climbed back into the SUV and drove off, kicking up dust in his wake. I had no doubt Margaret would escalate things now. But I wasn't going to wait for her next move. I had a plan of my own. I spent the rest of the day gathering evidence. I combed through financial records, printed out old property surveys, and compiled a list of homeowners willing to testify. I wasn't just going to win this case in court. I was going to expose the entire corrupt foundation Fox Hollow was built on. That night, I met with my lawyer, William, to finalize our strategy. He was an older man, nearing retirement, but he had a sharp mind and an even sharper instinct for sniffing out fraud. He flipped through the documents I had brought, nodding slowly. "This is solid," he admitted, "but it won't be enough on its own. The judge will want concrete proof that the HOA engaged in fraudulent activity." I tapped a folder sitting on his desk. "That's where this comes in." William opened it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents. Then he let out a low whistle. "Where did you get these?" "An anonymous tip," I said vaguely. I wasn't about to reveal my source. Not yet. The folder contained a series of internal emails between Margaret and her top board members. They weren't just overcharging homeowners. They were laundering money through fake maintenance contracts, siphoning funds into offshore accounts, and deliberately targeting elderly residents with fabricated violations to push them into selling their homes below market value. "This," William said, "is enough to bury them." The next morning, I filed an official lawsuit against the Fox Hollow HOA. The moment the papers were served, the reaction was swift. The HOA board scrambled to contain the damage, Margaret went into hiding, and several homeowners who had been afraid to speak out finally stepped forward. Local news stations caught wind of the story, and within days, it became a media sensation. Reporters hounded Margaret for a statement, but she refused to comment. When the footage of her slamming her front door shut aired on the evening news, I knew we had her cornered. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse for her, they did. One of her own board members flipped. Apparently, he had been in charge of moving funds around and keeping the books clean. But with the walls closing in, he decided to save himself. He turned over records detailing every illegal transaction, every fraudulent charge, every homeowner who had been forced out under false pretenses. When the trial began, Margaret sat in the defendant's seat, her face stony and unreadable. But I could see the truth in her eyes. She knew this was the end. The judge ruled in my favor. The fraudulent land grab was reversed, the illegal development halted, and Margaret was ordered to pay back the millions she had stolen. But the real victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the community that finally got justice. In the weeks that followed, the HOA dissolved. The homeowners who had suffered under Margaret's reign of terror were given restitution. And as for me, I finally got back what was rightfully mine. As I stood on the porch of my grandfather's home, looking out over the land that had almost been stolen from me, I realized something. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a lesson, a reminder that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always catch up to them in the end. The trial may have been over, but the fallout was just beginning. Margaret's downfall sent shockwaves through the entire community. People who had once feared her were now coming forward with their own horror stories. Hidden fees, baseless fines, outright intimidation. The homeowners she had bullied into selling their properties filed lawsuits of their own, and before long, the full scope of her corruption was laid bare for everyone to see. But Margaret wasn't the only one facing consequences. Several members of the HOA board were implicated in the fraud, and one by one they resigned or were forced out. Richard Hayes, the slick lawyer who had tried to buy me off, disappeared from public view. Rumors swirled that he had been quietly disbarred. And as for Margaret herself, she was facing criminal charges, embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy. It was only a matter of time before she lost everything. I should have felt satisfied. I had won. The land was mine again, and the community was finally free from the chokehold of corruption. But there was still work to do. The HOA had collapsed, but that didn't mean the damage it had caused would simply vanish. Many of the homeowners had been struggling under the weight of unfair fees and legal threats for years. Some had lost their homes entirely. And the unfinished development site, the one Margaret had tried so desperately to push through, stood as an ugly reminder of the mess she had left behind. So I did something unexpected. I stepped up. At first, people were hesitant to trust me. I wasn't a local, at least not in the way they were. I had spent most of my life in the city, far removed from the struggles of Fox Hollow. But over time, that changed. I worked with the homeowners to rebuild their community, not under the iron grip of an HOA, but as a collective, where every person had a say. We repaired what we could, cleaned up the abandoned lots, and slowly started undoing the years of damage Margaret had caused. One of the first things we did was restore the land that had been illegally seized. Several of the homes that had been built on stolen property were grandfathered in, but instead of forcing people out, I gave them an option: stay. But with fair agreements and reasonable terms. No more ridiculous fines, no more predatory fees, just a fair and honest place to live. It wasn't just about property lines anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about taking back control. A year passed, and things finally started to settle. The town had changed, but for the better. People no longer lived in fear of petty fines or threats from a corrupt board. Margaret's mansion, once the symbol of her power, was auctioned off to pay her debts. The community center, which she had turned into her own personal headquarters, was repurposed into something useful. A place where people could gather, talk, and actually help one another. One evening, I found myself standing on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The land, my grandfather's land, stretched out before me, untouched and beautiful. It was finally back where it belonged. I reached into my pocket and pulled out an old letter, the one my grandfather had left behind, warning me about the people trying to steal what was ours. I had read it so many times I practically had it memorized. If you're reading this, it means the fight has begun. But I know you, and I know you won't back down. The land isn't just dirt and trees. It's history. It's family. Don't let them take it away. Stand your ground. And never let anyone tell you what's yours isn't worth fighting for. I smiled to myself, folding the letter carefully and tucking it away. I had done exactly what he asked. And now, finally, the fight was over.